What if the first kings of Sumer weren't the start of something brand new, but the last living thread of something much older? Out on the wind-scoured plains of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates cut through earth, the color of old ash, there are layers of silt stacked like pages in a book nobody's opened in thousands of years. And inside those layers, there are clay tablets, quiet, heavy, patient, pressed by hands that lived before Egypt raised its first pyramid, before Stonehenge threw its first shadow. And here's the thing, those marks weren't made to be mysterious. They weren't written as riddles. They were written to remember, to keep something alive that the world somehow almost lost. So, before we go deeper into the silence between these ancient cities, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're the kind of person who gets pulled toward the space between archaeology and memory. And if you're still here, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from right now. I always love imagining these forgotten voices stretching across oceans, finding ears that are finally ready to hear them, because this story doesn't begin with a discovery, it begins with a question no one expected to ask. In the late 1800s, archaeologists flooded into Mesopotamia, literally the land between rivers, expecting to find humanity's rough draft, the crude beginnings of government, villages stumbling toward order, scattered people slowly figuring out how to build, how to organize, how to record. But then their spades hit something that shouldn't have been there. They didn't uncover a messy learning curve. They uncovered precision, city layouts that looked planned, not improvised, temple complexes aligned with celestial points, irrigation systems stretching for miles across terrain that shouldn't have supported large populations, administrative tablets, tracking taxes, trade agreements, astronomical observations, mathematical systems so refined we still live inside them today. And right at the center of it all was the strangest part, kingship. Not kingship emerging gradually, no slow evolution from tribal chiefs to city rulers, but kingship appearing in the record like it had already been established for a long, long time. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. Their cities Eridu, Uruk, Shurupak rise out of southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BC, and what unsettles archaeologists is what isn't behind them. No crude prototypes, no awkward early attempts, no obvious developmental steps. It's like someone hit play on a civilization that was already running. And then scholars notice something even more disturbing. The earliest Sumerian rulers didn't describe themselves as founders. They didn't talk like people inventing history for the first time. They talked like people continuing something, preserving something. They wrote that kingship descended from heaven, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic flourish, but as a statement carved into clay delivered like fact. Their astronomers tracked Venus with a level of accuracy that still makes people blink. Their mathematicians worked in base 60, a system so powerful we still use it every day. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. Their engineers built massive structures that required real knowledge of load-bearing, water management, and long-term planning. None of this looks like a newborn society figuring things out. It looks like reconstruction, and in museum archives, London, Berlin, Baghdad, those clay tablets sit behind glass, some intact, some broken, but they all carry this same strange feeling, precision without precedent, knowledge without a visible origin. And woven through their everyday records between grain tallies and offering lists are references to something older, cities that existed before the flood, kings who ruled when the world was young, teachers who rose from the waters to instruct humanity in the arts of civilization. We call it mythology now. That's the label we put on it. But the label starts to feel thin when you realize how many cultures, separated by thousands of miles, carry the same core memory, a great deluge, an earlier world, and the surviving few who rebuilt. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Hindu traditions, Greek, indigenous flood stories across continents. At some point, the boundary between myth and memory starts to blur, and then you find the artifact that turns the whole thing from interesting to haunting. A king list. On the surface, it looks like bureaucracy, just a chronicle of rulers, their cities, and how long they reigned. The kind of thing you'd expect from a civilization obsessed with record-keeping. But as you read down the columns, the text splits into two worlds. Before the flood, 8 kings, reigns measured in spans like 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. After the flood, reigns shrink first into centuries, then decades, then into the kinds of numbers that feel human again. Modern scholars have tried to explain this for over a century. Maybe the numbers are symbolic astronomical cycles, encoded calendars, compressed dynasties, metaphors carved into mathematics. And sure, maybe. But here's what no one disputes. The Sumerians treated this list as real record. It wasn't kept in a separate myth category. It wasn't stored like a religious poem. Versions of it were copied and preserved alongside inventories, land records, tax accounts, documents used in administration and legal contexts. To them, this wasn't fantasy. It was memory. And sometimes this is the part that hits me the hardest. When you look closely at those tablets, you can still see fingerprints in the clay, the curve of a thumb, the press of a palm, hands from 5,000 years ago, saving something they believed mattered enough to endure. And when you sit with that, when you really let it land, a question starts to form in the quiet. What were they so desperate to remember? Because under the cities we've excavated, there are older foundations. Beneath the flood layers that clearly break habitation sequences, there are traces of something that doesn't quite fit. Architectural styles that appear briefly, then vanish. Pottery traditions that show up, then stop. Burial customs that hint at different beliefs, different origins, almost like different people. And the deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger it got. The record doesn't show Sumer slowly evolving in place. Around 4000 BC, the Ubaid culture long established across southern Mesopotamia changes abruptly. New architecture, new social hierarchies, new symbolic systems. Not a gentle transition, a sharp one, as if the population had been supplemented, replaced, or as if new groups arrived carrying older traditions they didn't develop locally. And at night, when the museums close and the lights dim over those rows of tablets, I can't help imagining them breathing in the dark, each one holding a fragment of a world we don't recognize anymore. We're taught to think of Sumer as the beginning of recorded history, the birthplace of civilization. But what if it wasn't a beginning at all? What if it was a rebuilding? The desert wind still moves over those ancient sites, carrying dust from cities buried for millennia. And if you listen closely, beneath all that silence, you can almost hear the start of a story. Not once upon a time, but once again. The Sumerians said, kingship descended from heaven, not symbolically, not metaphorically, as a straightforward claim. And if they weren't the first to understand kingship, if they were inheriting it, then who were they remembering? To answer that, we have to go beneath Sumer itself, down into the layers of mud and stone where one world ended and another began. And that brings us to Eridu, because when archaeologists began excavating Eridu in 1946, led by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, they expected the usual story. Simple huts, then modest buildings, then complexity over time. But what they uncovered at the deepest levels didn't look like a society learning how to build. It looked like a society that already knew. At Eridu, the excavation didn't unfold the way archaeology textbooks say it should. Fuad Safar and his team went in expecting a normal progression, humans living in simple huts, then gradually upgrading to more complex structures as organization and technology slowly improved. That's the pattern you're supposed to see when you dig down through time. Crude first, refined later. But Eridu flipped the whole script. The lowest habitation level, the oldest layer they could reach, didn't hold a rough shelter or a primitive camp. It held a temple. Not a maybe this was sacred structure. Not a vague gathering spot. A temple with a central altar, offering tables, a deliberate floor plan, architectural features that show planning, symmetry, and something close to sacred geometry. And when they dug beneath that temple, there was another one, and beneath that, another. 18 successive temples, stacked like a staircase of time, each built on the same sacred spot. And yes, the later ones become more elaborate, bigger platforms, more complex layouts, but the first one is the part that shouldn't exist. It starts with sophistication. The city hadn't learned to build temples. Its precedent in the Praesides. It began with one, and Eridu wasn't the only place telling this story. Uruk, the most famous of the early Sumerian cities, tells the same impossible tale in brick and stone. When archaeologists began uncovering Uruk in the 1,850 seconds, they didn't find a small village that slowly grew. They found evidence of a city that had already made a leap big enough to demand coordination, planning, and a level of authority that doesn't normally appear overnight. The city walls alone stretch roughly 6 miles in circumference. Think about what that means. A defensive perimeter on that scale requires not just labor, but management. Someone had to organize thousands of workers. Someone had to secure resources. Someone had to decide where the walls went, how thick they'd be, how they'd be maintained. That's not something you do by accident. Inside those walls sat the White Temple, massive, elevated on a platform, its corners aligned precisely to the cardinal directions. That alignment is not a casual detail. To build something square to true north, you need surveying techniques, you need astronomical observation, you need geometry, and you need confidence in those methods, because if you're wrong at the foundation level, you can't fix it later without tearing the whole thing apart. The White Temple appears in the record like someone already knew exactly what they were doing. And then there's Shuruppak. When excavators worked there, they discovered administrative buildings loaded with clay tablets, contracts, trade agreements, temple inventories, agricultural records organized by season and field location. Not a handful of notes, thousands of tablets. And the society those tablets reveal is not primitive. They use standardized weights and measures. They had formalized legal procedures. They ran a hierarchical bureaucracy. They calculated interest on loans. They tracked lunar cycles. They organized time, harvest, labor, and law like an institution that had been running for generations. These aren't people experimenting with governance. These are people running a system with memory. So, the question archaeologists kept running into again and again was painfully simple. Where did they learn this? Because civilizations are supposed to stumble. They're supposed to make obvious mistakes early on. You're supposed to see messy prototypes, slow refinement, trial, error, correction. But the Sumerians, at least in the record we have, skip that whole phase. And then the rulers themselves make it even stranger. The first king, named in Sumerian tradition, is Alulim. According to the texts, he ruled from Eridu for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, ruled for 36,000, and Menluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200. Numbers that don't just stretch credibility, they break the concept of human history entirely. And what makes it unsettling isn't only the numbers, it's the tone. These aren't carved like mythical poems. They aren't framed like legends told around a fire. They're recorded the way you'd record a census, matter of fact, like the scribes writing them weren't mystical storytellers. They were accountants, and the King List sits right alongside completely mundane documents, receipts for barley, livestock records, field boundary measurements, lists of temple offerings. It's the same scribal world, the same hands, which means these reign lengths weren't being separated into a category called fiction. Modern scholars, of course, have proposed interpretations. Some say the numbers represent dynasties, not individuals, whole lines of kings compressed into a single name. Others argue the numbers encode astronomical cycles. For example, 43,200 has neat mathematical relationships in sacred calendars. Some suggest timekeeping differences, maybe years, meant lunar months or seasons, and those interpretations might be partly right. But here's the detail that keeps pulling people back into the mystery. The King List divides itself deliberately. 8 rulers before the flood, then a hard break, then rulers whose reigns shrink down over time until they become recognizably human. It reads like a boundary marker, like a record of 2 different orders of existence. And the wording at the top of the most complete version, the famous Weld-Blundell prism housed at the Ashmolean Museum, makes the claim even sharper. After the kingship descended from heaven, that phrase is doing a lot of work, because it doesn't say kingship was created. It doesn't say kingship was invented. It says kingship descended, as if it came from somewhere else first, as if it belonged to a prior order and was delivered into the human world. And in Sumerian, that distinction matters. Their scribes had different ways to describe creating something new versus bringing something from elsewhere. When they chose descended, they were choosing the language of transmission, not invention. And Sumer isn't alone in remembering an older age. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of a time before the flood when the gods moved among humans. The Eridu Genesis describes how the first cities were destroyed and how kingship had to be re-established. Later Babylonian texts still reference old cities that were swept away, as if urban civilization wasn't born once but broken, then rebuilt. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, because the ground itself seems to echo that story. At multiple sites across southern Iraq, Kish, Shuruppak, and others, archaeologists found thick layers of water-laid silt interrupting the habitation sequences. These flood deposits date to around 2900 BC, and they create a clear line in the dirt. Below the silt, one kind of pottery, one architectural style, one set of burial customs. Above it, something different pottery, different building methods, different cultural signatures. Something had changed. Was it population movement? Cultural replacement? New groups arriving? Integration after catastrophe? Archaeology doesn't always let you pin down one simple answer, but it does let you see discontinuity, and that discontinuity sits in the dirt at the same moment the texts talk about a catastrophic flood. So, if there really was a flood that shattered one order, the question becomes unavoidable. What was destroyed, and where had it come from? Because the oldest kings aren't described like warlords clawing their way to power. They're described like builders, measurers, establishers of sacred ordinances, people whose authority didn't sound negotiated or conquered. It simply existed like an inherited legitimacy, like a continuation of something older. And sometimes, when I try to picture those first rulers, I can't help imagining them standing in the wet mud of southern Mesopotamia with a kind of quiet grief, carrying memories of cities that no longer existed, teaching temple construction they'd seen somewhere else, organizing governance systems they didn't invent here, preserving astronomy observed under skies their descendants would never see again, not inventing civilization, remembering it, because when you line up the evidence, the sudden appearance of complex administration, the architectural sophistication without a learning curve, the mathematical and astronomical precision, the king list bridging two worlds, the flood layers marking real breaks, the pattern starts to look less like a beginning and more like a continuation, which leads to the question that won't leave you alone once you hear it. If Sumer's founders weren't pioneers creating something new, if they were survivors preserving something old, then what world were they running from? And why does it leave so little trace? To get closer to that answer, we have to look even deeper than the flood line, deeper than temples and walls, into the cultural layers beneath Sumer, where one people's world seems to end and another people's world begins. When archaeologists talk about civilizations rising, we tend to imagine growth like a slow sunrise. A village becomes a town becomes a city, customs gradually evolve, technology improves step by step. Over generations, things get more complex. That's the model we're used to because most of the time the evidence supports it. But southern Mesopotamia doesn't always play by that model. And one of the clearest examples is the shift archaeologists label the transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3500 BC. On paper, it's a neat academic phrase, just a timeline bracket. In the ground, it looks like a rupture. The Ubaid culture had been thriving across Mesopotamia for centuries. Not a tiny, short-lived group, this was a stable way of life that spread widely. Their pottery is distinctive. Painted designs, geometric patterns, triangles, zigzags, flowing lines in dark pigment on buff-colored clay. There's personality in it, a feeling of individual artistry. Their architecture was modest, adapted to local conditions, mud brick and reeds, practical homes, small community layouts. They often buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, keeping the ancestors close, literally under the same roof as the living. Then, within what looks like a relatively compressed span of time, the world changes. First, the pottery shifts. The painted Ubaid designs fade out and vanish, replaced by mass-produced vessels, fast wheel-thrown, utilitarian, unpainted, standardized. You can almost feel the difference, a move from handmade identity to industrial efficiency. This isn't a gradual drift in style. It's like someone flipped a switch, and then burial practices shift too. Instead of dead beneath homes, you begin to see separate cemeteries, new orientations, different grave goods, altered ritual signals. The relationship between the living and the dead, between ancestry and identity, seems to reorganize. Architecture changes even more dramatically. Ubaid structures are modest and organic, but Uruk period buildings suddenly arrive at monumental scale. Massive temple platforms, complex multi-room structures, and fortified walls that imply centralized authority and coordinated labor forces numbering in the thousands. It's not just better houses, it's a different social reality, and alongside that comes a shift in symbolic systems. Seals, figurines, ritual objects, Ubaid motifs give way to new iconography, different sacred animals, different divine associations, different expressions of cosmic order. When archaeologists document this transition across dozens of sites, the pattern keeps repeating, a clear break in material culture occurring within a surprisingly short period. And that's where the unease starts to creep in, because cultural evolution doesn't usually work this way. When societies develop organically, pottery styles drift gradually, techniques evolve across generations. You can trace the pathway. you can see the learning curve. But between Ubaid and Uruk, that pathway looks thin, missing, like a page torn out. So what happened? One possibility is that the region experienced demographic change. New people arrived. Existing populations were absorbed, displaced, or reorganized, or perhaps both. And here's where modern science adds another layer to the puzzle. In 2016, a team of geneticists published analysis of ancient DNA from skeletal remains across Mesopotamian sites. And what they reported was unexpected: evidence of genetic discontinuity between earlier populations and later ones. In other words, the people living in southern Mesopotamia during the later phase show markers suggesting admixture with groups from other regions, ancestral signals that aren't as visible in earlier centuries. The technical phrase for this kind of pattern is demographic replacement. It doesn't necessarily mean violent invasion. It can mean migration, integration, refugee flows, new groups arriving during crisis. But it does mean something important: arrival. And if populations arrived, bringing their own traditions, their own skills, their own way of organizing life, it could explain why Uruk civilization appears so sudden in the archaeological record. Because the suddenness might be an illusion created by the fact that the foundations weren't developed locally, they were imported. Now, let's go back to Eridu for a moment, because that site offers one of the most haunting details in this whole story. In some layers, archaeologists found evidence of temple construction abandoned mid-renovation, tools left behind, bricks prepared but never placed, a project stopped abruptly. Then a thick layer of water-laid sediment covered the site, fine mud, silt left behind by flood waters, and above that flood line, when construction resumes, the techniques shift. Brick dimensions change, architectural principles change, orientation changes. The flood didn't just interrupt a building project, it interrupted continuity. Something similar shows up at Ur. In the 1922, Leonard Woolley, the famous British archaeologist, excavated deep into the layers of Ur and found an 8-foot layer of clean clay, sterile sediment with no artifacts. No signs of human habitation. Above and below that clay were 2 different cultural phases. Woolley famously claimed he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Modern archaeology is more careful with sweeping declarations like that, but the physical fact remains. Something deposited a massive layer of silt or clay that cut the timeline in half. Something catastrophic enough to erase evidence of life for a stretch of depth. And then people came back, or new people came, and the culture on the other side isn't the same. What makes all of this more unsettling is how the Sumerians describe themselves. Their texts don't present them as indigenous children of the soil. They don't call themselves the people of this land. They call themselves the black-headed people, an identity marker, not a geographic claim. And in some sources, they add a phrase that's even more striking. They describe themselves as those who were brought up from the water, not merely who crossed water, not who travelled by boat, in quote, in naught of the praise end, brought up from it. The language feels like emergence, rising, deliverance, survivors, and in their mythological texts, like the Eridu Genesis, the memory becomes even more explicit. The story describes how the first cities existed when kingship was first lowered from heaven, how those cities were swept away by flood, and how survivors rebuilt civilization according to the old ways. Again, not allegory, not metaphor, but the tone of something remembered. Now, put the pieces together. Abrupt cultural transformation in the material record, flood layers interrupting habitation at multiple sites, evidence suggesting population movement and admixture, traditions describing an earlier world and a catastrophic flood, a people identifying themselves as brought up from the water, a kingship that descended rather than emerged. It paints a picture that's hard to ignore. The people who built classical Sumer weren't simply the same group that had occupied the land for the previous 2,000 years. They were newcomers, or descendants of newcomers, arriving during or after environmental catastrophe and demographic upheaval. But newcomers from where? If the Ubaid populations represent a long local development, then the Uruk peoples, the Proto-Sumerians, might be carrying something from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is the thing that doesn't show up cleanly in the archaeological record, because it may no longer be on land at all. Because if you start looking at what was happening to Earth during the millennia before Sumer, you find a timeline that's honestly terrifying. Approximately 12,000 years ago, Earth was a different planet. Ice sheets miles thick covered huge portions of North America and northern Europe. Sea levels sat about 120 meters lower than today. Coastlines were far out. Land bridges existed where ocean now is. Entire coastal plains, fertile, habitable, rich with life, were exposed. And the Persian Gulf? The Persian Gulf wasn't a gulf. It was a river valley, a wide, fertile basin with lakes, streams, wetlands, and habitable land stretching from modern Kuwait toward the Strait of Hormuz. Multiple rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, would have fed into this basin, creating what some researchers describe as an ecological paradise. And humans lived on those coasts. They built communities where rivers met the sea, where fish and game were plentiful, where soil was rich. They would have had generations to adapt to this environment, to form complex societies, to refine tools, to develop trade along waterways. Then, around 10,900 BC, something shifts. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary, an abrupt climate transition. The planet warms rapidly. Ice begins to collapse. Meltwater floods into the oceans, and sea levels begin to rise, not slowly, not gently. In pulses, one major surge, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, raises sea levels by roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. That's not a gradual change. That's a moving wall of coastline retreating inland within human lifetimes. Imagine watching the shoreline creep closer year after year, swallowing the places your grandparents were born. And the pulses continue. Another surge around 8000 BC, smaller pulses afterward. By roughly 6000 BC, sea levels have risen around 120 meters from the Ice Age minimum, which means whole landscapes vanished, including that Persian Gulf River valley. So if there were people living there, and geology strongly suggests it was habitable, then when the waters came, they had two options: drown, or flee north, inland, toward the land that would later become Sumer. And here's the haunting part. Marine surveys of the Gulf floor in the late 20th and early 21st centuries detected ancient river channels carved into bedrock, now submerged. Along those channels, sonar imaging has reportedly picked up formations consistent with human settlement, geometric patterns suggestive of structural remains. No one has excavated them at full depth. It's incredibly difficult, but the implication is hard to escape. People lived there, and when the basin flooded, their world disappeared. If survivors escaped, their descendants might eventually reach southern Mesopotamia, carrying fragments of what had existed before the water, fragments of systems, fragments of knowledge, fragments of memory. Which brings us right back to the Sumerian King List and the strange obsession with the flood boundary. Because what if the list isn't trying to tell us that individuals literally lived 40,000 years? What if it's preserving the memory of deep time of an era so ancient, so distant, that later scribes could only compress it into numbers too large to fit human lifespan? What if those pre-flood kings aren't fairy tale immortals, but the symbolic echo of leadership from a world that drowned? If that's true, then Sumer isn't the start of civilization. It's the moment civilization finally got stable enough, after catastrophe, to write down what it had been carrying for millennia. And that leads into the next piece of the puzzle, the document that bridges the drowned world and the rebuilt one more directly than anything else. Sumer left us. The Sumerian King List itself, in all its copies, and the way it was treated not as myth, but as official history. The Sumerian King List is one of those artifacts that looks boring until you actually read it, because on the surface, it's just administration, a list of rulers, their cities, their reign lengths, the kind of document you'd expect any organized state to maintain, a ledger of legitimacy. But the more you sit with it, the more it starts to feel like you're staring at a crack in the timeline. The King List exists in over a dozen copies, tablets, and clay prisms found in different cities, copied and recopied across centuries. That matters because it tells you this wasn't a one-off scribal curiosity. It wasn't a quirky religious poem that one temple kept. It was a document people valued enough to preserve for a very long time. The most complete version we have is called the Weld Blundell Prism. It's housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And when you picture it, don't imagine a neat modern sheet of paper. Imagine a clay prism, inscribed on multiple sides with columns of cuneiform text, like someone wrapped a whole historical ideology around a single object. What makes it so unsettling isn't just what it says, it's how it was used. Because the King List wasn't treated as mythology. It was filed alongside grain accounts, land surveys, temple inventories, hard administrative records. Kings referenced it to establish legitimacy. Scribes copied it with the same seriousness they copied taxation documents. It functioned as an official historical framework, a backbone for political continuity, and the official history begins with an impossible sentence. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, again descended, not invented, not developed, not negotiated, descended, like something brought down from an established order. Then, the list starts naming rulers, 8 kings, and their reigns aren't just long, they're unreal. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. Enmenlu Ana, 43,200 years. Names continue, numbers continue, and by the time you reach the last pre-flood ruler, Ubara Tutu, you're looking at a total of 241,200 years of kingship before the flood. Then the list gives you one simple line, almost casually. The flood swept over. That's it. No drama. No description. No poetic mourning. Just a sentence. And immediately after that sentence, the numbers collapse. Post-flood kings still reigned for long spans, at first hundreds of years, sometimes more, but nothing like the pre-flood scale. And then the numbers keep shrinking. Century-length reigns become decades. Decades become normal human reigns. By the time the list reaches historical dynasties, we can cross-check with archaeology. We're in the territory of 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It's like the King List is watching time normalize, like it's recording the transition from one reality to another. Now, historians have argued for generations about what these numbers mean, and honestly, some of the interpretations are convincing in pieces. One popular explanation is that the numbers aren't random, they're structured. Many of them are built from base 60 math, the same system Sumer used for calculation, 43,000. 200, for example, can be expressed as 120 times 360. 36,000 is 100 times 360. Those aren't accidents. They suggest a possible calendrical or astronomical encoding, like the rains represent cycles, not literal lifespans. Another explanation is dynastic compression. Maybe Alalim doesn't mean one man who lived 28,800 years. Maybe it represents an entire line of rulers, an era collapsed into a single name for the sake of tradition. A third interpretation is that the numbers are preserving deep time, not in a geological sense, but in a cultural memory sense, the vast span between a world that existed before catastrophe and the moment when survivors finally stabilized enough to rebuild recognizable kingship. But here's the key point, and it's the one people sometimes miss when they get lost in the math. Whatever the numbers mean, the structure is deliberate. The list is insisting that kingship existed before the flood, and that after the flood, kingship continued. It's drawing a line between two epochs, but it's also building a bridge between them. It's saying, this is not the first time order existed. This is a restoration. And that theme shows up again when you look at which cities held kingship before the flood. The list names 5: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Notice something? They're all southern. They're all clustered in the same region where Sumer later flourished. And that's led some scholars to assume the pre-flood cities were simply earlier versions of the same places. But another possibility is harder and stranger. What if those names were carried forward? Because throughout the ancient Near East, cities were often refounded after destruction, sometimes on the same site, sometimes nearby, sometimes far enough away that the new city was more like a memorial, built to preserve the sacred identity of the old. If a catastrophic event drowned earlier settlements, especially coastal ones, then survivors might have carried the names, the rituals, and the spiritual identity of those lost places inland. They would build new cities and give them old names, not because the geography matched, but because the memory demanded continuity. In that case, Eridu might not just be a location, it might be a legacy, a name anchored to an older homeland. And this is where the King List becomes something more than a chronology. It becomes a transmission document, a political and spiritual declaration that says, we didn't invent civilization, we inherited it. We are part of something older. That's why it was treated as fact, because for the Sumerians, legitimacy wasn't just about who held power now. It was about continuity with cosmic order, with heaven, meaning the realm of unchanging principles. Kingship descending from heaven was not a cute phrase. It was the claim that authority was rooted in an eternal pattern that existed before the present world. So when later kings consulted the list, they weren't just reading history, they were tying themselves to a lineage that survived the end of an age. And if that lineage survived, then what else survived with it? Because kingship doesn't exist in isolation. You can't maintain a state without administrative techniques. You can't build temples without geometry and engineering. You can't run irrigation networks without understanding gradients and water flow. You can't maintain a calendar without astronomy, which is why the next question becomes unavoidable. If Sumer's kings inherited political memory from a drowned world, did they also inherit technical knowledge? And once you ask that, the evidence starts coming at you from all directions. When early scholars began deciphering Sumerian mathematical tablets in the early 20th century, they expected simple counting, basic arithmetic, enough to track grain and livestock. But what they found wasn't basic. It was sophisticated. Sumerians calculated in base 60, not base 10, not the obvious system built around 10 fingers. a sexagesimal framework that makes fractions and divisions incredibly powerful because 60 divides cleanly into so many factors. It's why we still divide time the way we do. It's why the circle has 360 degrees. And here's what bothers historians. The earliest mathematical tablets already show full operational knowledge of this system. No transitional phase. No proto-base 60 experiments. Just competence. Their astronomy carries the same weight. Observations of Venus cycles. Tracking of rising and setting stars. Calendrical structures that imply long-term systematic observation. You don't get that by watching the sky for a year or two. You get that by building an institution, generations of observers, records, corrections, refinements, which brings us back to the same pattern we keep seeing. Sumer doesn't feel like a first attempt. It feels like a continuation, like someone arrived with a toolkit already assembled. And if that's true, then the clay tablets aren't just accounting records. They're the crystallized edge of a much older stream knowledge that flowed through catastrophe and finally found a place stable enough to be written down. So now we have to follow that stream into its most precise forms: mathematics, astronomy, engineering, the systems that appear fully formed at the dawn of Sumer and shouldn't, at least not if Sumer was truly the beginning. Because if those systems were inherited, then somewhere before Sumer there was a world that already knew them. When people imagine the first civilization, they often picture humans fumbling their way into complexity, simple counting, crude architecture, rough calendars based on seasons and guesswork. That's what archaeologists expected to find in early Mesopotamian tablets, the math equivalent of cave drawings. But what they actually found was closer to a blueprint. Sumerian mathematics doesn't read like a baby learning to crawl. It reads like an adult walking into the room and immediately doing calculus. Okay, not literally calculus, but you get the feeling. Because right from the beginning, Sumer is using base 60, a sexagesimal system, and base 60 is not the natural default for humans. Base 10 is obvious because it's built into our bodies. 10 fingers, 10 toes. Most societies end up there because it's intuitive. Base 60 is different. It's abstract. It's optimized. It's a system designed for division because 60 can be divided cleanly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That makes fractional calculations, especially for trade, measurement, and astronomy, far easier than in base 10. And that's why it survived. We still live inside it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't random traditions we inherited because humans like round numbers. They're the fossilized imprint of Sumerian math. What's unsettling is that Sumerians appear in the record already doing this. The earliest mathematical tablets from Uruk, dated around 3400 BC, show full operational competence. Not we're trying something new. Not we're experimenting. They're using the system like it's already normal. So where did it come from? That question gets even sharper when you look at their astronomy. Because Sumerian and early Babylonian astronomical traditions include observations that require long-term systematic tracking. For instance, Venus. Venus is bright, sure, but it's also tricky. Its appearances as morning star and evening star follow cycles that aren't immediately obvious. You don't understand Venus's patterns by casually glancing at the sky. Yet Mesopotamian records, built on earlier Sumerian foundations, track Venus cycles with striking precision. They understood its synodic period, roughly 584 days. They could predict appearances. They tracked helical risings and settings. They noted patterns across repeated cycles. That kind of knowledge implies something deeper than curiosity. It implies institutional observation over time. You need trained observers, consistent record keeping, and mathematical tools to detect and predict cycles across years, decades, possibly centuries. Then there's the broader star catalogue tradition. Later compilations like the Mull API, assembled in the first millennium BC, but drawing on much older material, list dozens of constellations and document the rising and setting times of stars across the year. They map out the paths of the sun, moon, and planets. They identify equinoxes and solstices. They calculate seasonal daylight changes. This is systematic astronomy. And again, what bothers historians is the same thing that bothers them everywhere else in early Sumer. There's no visible warm-up phase. It's not like we find a sequence of tablets. First we guessed, then we got better, then we refined. The knowledge is already there, embedded in their culture as if inherited. And then, of course, there's engineering. Mud brick gets underestimated because it sounds simple. People hear mud brick and imagine crude lumps of clay slapped together. But Sumerian bricks weren't random. They were standardized, produced to a precise ratio optimized for stability and modular construction. Many bricks follow proportional schemes that distribute weight efficiently. This isn't the kind of thing you arrive at on day one without trial and error. It implies that someone figured out the geometry of load-bearing structures and institutionalized it. Even more impressive, irrigation. Southern Mesopotamia is fertile only if you can control water. And controlling water is not intuitive. A canal dug at the wrong gradient will either flood, stagnate, or drain too slowly. Managing a canal network requires understanding slope, flow rate, seasonal changes, sedimentation, and labor coordination for maintenance. Yet the earliest Sumerian irrigation systems don't look like crude experiments. They look like confident implementations. Canals running from the Euphrates across miles, fields organized into managed agricultural zones, systems that functioned for centuries. And then there's monumental architecture, the kind that makes you realize you're not looking at a small village that accidentally got ambitious. The White Temple at Uruk sits on a platform aligned to cardinal directions with extremely high precision. The platform itself requires foundation engineering, drainage planning, and structural support. Millions of bricks placed with intention, and the temple's existence implies not just building skills, but a social system capable of mobilizing labor, feeding workers, organizing materials, and maintaining a centralized plan, which loops us back to the same problem. If Sumer was the beginning, where did this knowledge come from? Because knowledge like this doesn't just pop into existence. It's built through accumulation, through generations, through mistakes, unless it's being brought in. And once you start looking beyond Sumer, the mystery gets bigger instead of smaller, because there are other sites in the Near East that seem to display sophistication far earlier than we're supposed to expect. Göbekli Tepe is the obvious example, a site in southern Turkey with massive carved stone pillars arranged in circular complexes dating back to around 9,600 BC, long before agriculture, long before pottery, long before anything we usually associate with civilization. Some pillars weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried, transported, carved with detailed animal reliefs, and erected in deliberate arrangements. To do that, you need more than brute strength. You need organization. You need planning. You need specialized labor. You need someone who knows how to coordinate a large project. And Göbekli Tepe isn't an isolated weirdness. It's part of a broader pattern, sophisticated techniques and monumental construction appearing earlier than expected, then later civilizations rising with fully formed systems. It suggests that human complexity may have been developing in pockets long before the official start of history, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. By the time Sumer appears, a foundation of technical knowledge might already exist in the region, not as scattered experiments, but as mature traditions. So again, where did that foundation originate? And here's where Sumer's own myths start to sound less like fantasy and more like encoded history, because Mesopotamian tradition speaks of the Apkallu, the seven sages. In the stories, these are semi-divine beings who emerge from the waters to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They instruct people in temple construction, irrigation, writing, law, and celestial observation. The first sage, Adapa, is described as profoundly wise, complete in understanding, the one who perfects divine ordinances. Later Babylonian sources list the Apkallu by name and connect each to a pre-flood king. They're described not as gods in the full sense, but as advisors, court counselors with expertise. Scholars tend to interpret the Apkallu as mythological symbols, embodied wisdom, allegory. But think about what the tradition is actually saying. Teachers arrived from the water. They possessed advanced knowledge. They trained humanity in the foundations of organized life. Now strip away the imagery. If a coastal civilization was destroyed by rising seas, the survivors who fled inland wouldn't just be random farmers. Among them would be specialists, engineers, priests, administrators, astronomers, craftsmen, the people whose skills were too valuable to lose. Small groups of such specialists showing up in new regions, carrying knowledge that local populations didn't have, would look like something supernatural. They would seem like sages. And if their origin was a drowned homeland, the sea claiming their land then over generations, the memory of them could easily become, they came from the waters. Not because they were fish people, because their world was underwater now. This idea also explains something else. Why Sumerian systems show competence right away. If the mathematics, astronomy, and engineering traditions were inherited from teachers who already knew them passed down through apprenticeship and oral tradition, then the moment writing appears, the record would look like a sudden leap because the learning curve happened earlier, somewhere else, or in a period without written evidence. Writing doesn't capture the whole process. It captures the moment knowledge becomes visible. And that would mean Sumer's technical achievements aren't miracles. They're acts of remembrance. Fragments of older knowledge carried through catastrophe and finally anchored in clay. Which brings us naturally to the next question. Because if Sumer's myths preserve the memory of knowledge bearers arriving from the water, then what else do those myths preserve? What do they remember about the flood itself? About the world before it? About the survivors who rebuilt? Because if the mythology isn't just imagination, if it's memory wearing a mask, then the next layer of this story is waiting in the texts, where gods warn kings, where boats are built, where waters rise, and where civilization is salvaged piece by piece. And that takes us to one of the oldest narratives humanity ever wrote down, the Eridu Genesis. The Eridu Genesis is one of those texts that feels almost unreal when you remember how old it is. Not because it's dramatic, or poetic, or full of wild fantasy, though it does have those elements, but because it carries the weight of something that sounds like it's been told 1,000 times before it was finally written down. A story polished smooth by repetition. A story passed from mouth to mouth, family to family, across generations, until someone finally pressed it into clay. In the Eridu Genesis, the gods decide humanity has become too loud, too chaotic, too unmanageable, so they resolve to wipe it away with a flood. But before the waters rise, a god Enki warns a righteous king named Ziusudra. He tells him to build a boat to preserve life, to carry the seed of living creatures through the catastrophe. Then comes the deluge, days and nights of storm and drowning. When the water recedes, Ziusudra offers sacrifices. The gods grant him life beyond ordinary human limits, settling him in Dilmun, described as a pure, bright land where the sun rises. And yes, the structure is familiar. It should be. Because you can trace it forward into the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, into the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, into the Hebrew story of Noah, into flood narratives across cultures that never should have been able to share a single tale, at least not easily. But here's what makes the Mesopotamian versions feel different. They don't just tell you there was a flood, they tell you what existed before it. And what mattered most about survival wasn't just staying alive, it was preserving knowledge, preserving order, preserving the blueprint of civilization. That theme keeps coming back, especially when you focus on Enki. Enki is the god of wisdom, fresh water, and sacred knowledge. In Mesopotamian tradition, he's the preserver, the one who safeguards civilization's foundations, the one who understands the deep patterns of reality and makes sure they don't vanish. But pay attention to the language used around him. Enki isn't described as creating everything from nothing. He bestows knowledge, he reveals it, he brings it forth, and he's constantly associated with the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Enki dwells in the deep. He guards wisdom in hidden waters, and then he brings it up to the surface world. The imagery is consistent, knowledge emerging from below, rising from the depths, coming from water. Now, if you take mythology literally, that's divine symbolism. But if you take mythology as encoded memory history translated into story, then the symbolism becomes interesting. Because what if Enki isn't describing a literal god in the ocean? What if Enki is describing origin? What if the tradition is remembering that knowledge came from a drowned world, that the people who carried it inland were from the waters because their homeland had been swallowed? In other words, Enki might represent the collective memory of knowledge bearers, specialists, teachers, administrators who preserved critical skills through catastrophe. And this is where the tradition of the Apkallu becomes even more explicit. Later Babylonian accounts, including those attributed to Berossus, a priest writing in the 3rd century BC, describe the first sage as Oannes, a being said to emerge from the Persian Gulf. Berossus describes Oannes as amphibious, returning to the sea at night, but by day teaching humans. What did he teach? Writing, sciences, arts, city building, temple construction, law, geometry. That's the list. And yeah, the image of an amphibious fishman sounds ridiculous to modern ears. It's easy to dismiss, but strip away the literal imagery and look at the underlying memory being preserved. A teacher came from the sea. He brought advanced knowledge. He taught people the foundations of civilization. If your homeland had drowned and your survivors arrived inland, the sea wouldn't just be geography, it would be identity. And over centuries, the literal truth of migration from flooded lands can become mythic truth, sages emerging from water, a drowned world turning into the Abzu, teachers turning into semi-divine beings. This isn't how myths become false, it's how myths preserve truth in a form strong enough to survive thousands of years. And Mesopotamian myth doesn't just preserve the idea of teachers from water, it preserves places' geographic memories that line up with what geology says once existed. Take Dilmun. In the texts, Dilmun is described as a blessed land, pure, bright, free of sickness and death, abundant in fresh water, sometimes described as a place where the sun rises over the sea. Later, archaeology connects Dilmun with Bahrain, a small island in the Persian Gulf that was a major trade hub in antiquity. But the older descriptions sometimes feel like they're reaching for something bigger than an island, a homeland. a paradise lost. And if you've been following the geological timeline, you can probably feel where this is going. Because the Persian Gulf, in the Ice Age, wasn't an oceanic gulf. It was a vast river valley, a fertile basin, filled with freshwater inflow, wetlands, fish, birds, reeds, date palms, an oasis on a scale that would have felt paradise-like compared to the harsh interior. If people lived there, and that valley flooded, then Dilmun might not be a trade island at first. It might be the memory of the drowned homeland itself compressed, mythologized, sanctified. A place remembered as perfect because it was the last place their ancestors lived in abundance. And then there's Aratta. Sumerian texts describe Aratta as a wealthy, distant land, rich in metals and stones, ruled by wise kings, protected by mountains. In stories like Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, it appears as a kind of rival or sister civilization connected to Sumer by trade, diplomacy, and shared cultural concepts. Scholars argue about where Aratta was, the Iranian plateau, the Zagros region, maybe even farther. But the consistent theme is that Aratta is old, sophisticated, and respected, almost like Sumer is looking toward it and saying, "We recognize you." If multiple groups fled flooded regions and spread into different refuges, some into Mesopotamia, others into highlands, then distant memories of shared origin could survive as legends of connected lands, ancient partners, older centers of civilization. And the pattern doesn't stop with Mesopotamia. If you zoom out, you see flood myths everywhere, and they share the same emotional structure even when the cultures are completely separated. A world before the flood, a catastrophic deluge, a small group of survivors, the preservation of knowledge, law, sacred tradition, the rebuilding of civilization. Hindu traditions describe Manu surviving a flood and preserving sacred knowledge. Greek myth remembers Deucalion, rebuilding humanity after Zeus's deluge. Indigenous Australian stories speak of sea levels rising and swallowing ancestral plains. Andean myths describe Viracocha emerging after floodwaters to teach civilization. People often assume this is cultural borrowing stories passing along trade routes, but the distribution is too wide, too deep, too repeated. There's another explanation that is increasingly hard to dismiss. These myths remember something real, not one single worldwide tsunami, but the end of the last ice age when sea levels rose more than 120 meters, drowning coastal plains and reshaping the world. Different regions experience different versions of the catastrophe. Gradual encroachment here, sudden breaching floods there, pulses of meltwater pushing shorelines inland. But the human experience would have been the same. Loss, displacement, a world disappearing, and the survivors telling their children, "The water took everything." Now, here's where the Sumerian story becomes especially striking, because Sumer's texts don't just say there was a flood. They insist that civilization existed before it. They list kings. They name cities. They describe sages serving courts. They preserve the idea that knowledge survived and had to be brought back. When you compare that with archaeology, the discontinuities, the flood layers, the abrupt cultural shifts, and geology, the drowning of coastal landscapes, then the myth starts to feel less like fantasy and more like testimony. And if the myths are preserving real memory, then the teachers from the water aren't random motifs. They're the mythic form of a very specific historical process. Displaced people carried their expertise inland, and over time, those people became gods. Their expertise became divine ordinance. Their homeland became paradise. Their catastrophe became the boundary line between ages, which brings us right back to the key idea behind this entire story. Sumer didn't see itself as the first civilization. It saw itself as the inheritor of one. And when they wrote, when they built temples, when they tracked planets, when they listed kings, they weren't just inventing. They were trying to preserve a thread that stretched back into a world that no longer existed above water. But there's one line of evidence we haven't touched yet, maybe the most intimate one of all. Because knowledge can travel, myths can spread, political systems can be adopted. But language? Language is identity at the deepest level. It's what people carry even when they lose everything else. So if Sumer's founders were migrants or descendants of migrants from a drowned world, then their language might preserve that origin in a way that pottery and temples can't. And Sumerian does something that almost no other ancient language does. It stands alone. It has no known relatives. It appears fully formed, then vanishes. A linguistic island in the middle of the ancient world, and if that isn't a clue, I don't know what is. So next, we have to step into the strangest part of the Sumerian puzzle, the Sumerian language itself, and why it looks like the voice of a people who came from somewhere that's no longer there. If you want one clue that feels almost too personal to be just archaeology, it's this. Sumerian has no known relatives. It's a linguistic orphan. A full language, complete with its own grammar, its own logic, its own worldview, appearing suddenly in the written record, then fading out of everyday speech, leaving behind thousands of clay tablets like a voice trapped in stone. When linguists first started deciphering cuneiform in the 1800s, they expected Sumerian to plug neatly into the map of known language families. Maybe it would be Semitic, like Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, maybe Indo-European, like Persian or Sanskrit, maybe linked to Anatolia or the Caucasus. Instead, it belonged to nothing. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate, a language with no demonstrable family tree, no parent language we can reconstruct, no cousins we can point to and say, see, they share the same roots. It stands alone, and it stands alone in a region where languages usually cluster and interrelate. That alone is strange, but what makes it even stranger is how the language appears, not as a rough early form, not as a half-built system, but as something already functioning, already complex, already stable from the moment writing begins. Because languages don't spontaneously generate. They evolve. They change in tiny steps. They borrow, drift, split into dialects, recombine. Even when a language becomes wildly different over time, the lineage usually leaves fingerprints. English, for example, can be traced backward through Old English, Proto-Germanic, and ultimately to a reconstructed Proto-Indo-European. The family tree is messy, but it's there. Sumerian has no tree, and that raises an uncomfortable question. If Sumerian has no known relatives, is it truly alone, or were its relatives erased? Because imagine an entire linguistic landscape existing in a region that later drowned coastal communities, speaking languages related to Sumerian, living in places that are now underwater. If that world vanished, those languages would vanish with it. And Sumerian would look isolated, not because it was born alone, but because it survived alone. That's not speculation pulled out of thin air. We've seen something similar elsewhere. Basque is another isolate, spoken in a pocket between France and Spain, surrounded by Indo-European languages. Many linguists believe Basque may be the last surviving remnant of a larger set of pre-Indo-European languages, once spoken across parts of Western Europe. The relatives disappeared. Basque endured protected by geography, preserved by identity. Now take that concept and move it to a region where geography didn't protect you, where geography drowned. If the Persian Gulf Basin once supported human settlement, And if its people spoke languages that don't exist anymore because their homelands are underwater, then Sumerian might be a fossil tongue, a surviving shard of an extinct linguistic world. And when you look at Sumerian's structure, it doesn't feel like a language that grew comfortably inside Mesopotamia. It feels like something that arrived. For one thing, Sumerian is agglutinative. That means it builds meaning by stacking grammatical pieces together like beads on a string. A single word can carry what, in English, might take a whole sentence. Instead of relying on separate helper words, Sumerian can pack relationships, possession, direction, tense, case into one long chain. It's a powerful system. It allows precision, but it also requires a deeply learned internal logic. It's not the kind of thing you develop overnight, and it doesn't resemble the surrounding Semitic languages in its fundamentals. Then there's word order. Sumerian commonly follows subject, object, verb. The action tends to come at the end. The man the bread ate, instead of the man ate the bread. SOV languages exist all over the world. Japanese, Turkish, Korean, so that alone isn't unique. But combined with its agglutinative structure and other features, Sumerian feels like it's operating on a different set of assumptions than the linguistic environment around it. And the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Sumerian makes a major distinction between animate and inanimate nouns, except the categories don't always line up with what modern minds expect. Certain natural forces are treated as animate. Certain objects carry a kind of grammatical life. Water, in particular, carries a weight in the language that feels more than practical. It suggests not just grammar, but worldview, a way of organizing reality that doesn't neatly match the later Semitic frameworks that dominate the region. Now here's the part that really gets under your skin: dialect. Because when a language spreads naturally across a region, it fractures. People pronounce words differently, local expressions develop, grammar shifts at the edges. Over time, you can map dialect zones like ripples. Latin fractures into Romance languages. Arabic becomes dozens of regional forms. English splits across continents. But Sumerian, across major city-states, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, shows remarkable uniformity in its written form. Yes, scribal conventions vary, certain spellings differ, but the core language remains stable across space and time in a way that feels managed. That could mean two things. Either Sumerian spread relatively recently from a single source too quickly for deep dialect divergence to appear, or it was artificially standardized by institutions, meaning scribes were trained into a formal version of the language that suppressed regional variation. Both possibilities suggest the same underlying point. Sumerian didn't behave like a language that had been slowly evolving in place for endless centuries across scattered villages. It behaves like a language with a strong identity, preserved deliberately, possibly carried into the region by a migrating population and maintained by elite institutions. And that fits unnervingly well with everything else we've been seeing. Because if displaced survivors moved inland from drowned coastlines, they wouldn't just carry tools and myths, they would carry their words. And the words would be sacred, because language is how you remember who you are when everything else is gone. It's the one thing you can rebuild instantly, without brick or metal. It's also the one thing that can survive for centuries, even if you lose everything physical, as long as the next generation keeps speaking it. Now look at this detail from Sumerian identity again, the black-headed people. Whatever that phrase originally meant, it doesn't anchor them to the land the way many ancient peoples describe themselves. It's not people of this soil or children of this river. It's an inward identity marker, and in some traditions, They describe themselves as those who were brought up from the water. If you take that literally, it sounds mythical. If you take it historically, it sounds like displacement, like a people defining themselves by a catastrophe that shaped their origin story. The water took the world, and we came up out of it. Now, there's another clue buried in the vocabulary itself. Sumerian has rich terminology for water, boats, canals, marshlands, fishing concepts that feel deeply integrated, not like a handful of borrowed trade terms. And that matters because in many languages, specialized vocabulary grows out of long cultural intimacy with an environment. A mountain people develops fine-grained words for slopes, passes, snow types. A desert people has precise words for winds, dunes, wells. A seafaring people develops deep vocabulary around currents, tides, boats, nets, storms. Sumerian doesn't feel like a language that just happens to live by rivers. It feels like a language that remembers water as central. And if that's true, then every clay tablet is doing more than preserving history. It's preserving a migrant identity in grammar. It's preserving an origin that no longer exists in geography. Which means when we say Sumerian has no relatives, we might be looking at the wrong problem. Maybe it had relatives. Maybe it had an entire family. Maybe that family lived in places that are now submerged coastal plains, river basins, wetlands that vanished under rising seas between 10,000 and 6,000 BC. And maybe Sumerian is what's left when the rest of the family tree was drowned and erased. A last surviving branch, carried inland by refugees, and later written down as the first great literary language of recorded history. If you step back, the convergence is hard to ignore. The King List insisting on a pre-flood world, the flood layers in the archaeological record, the abrupt cultural break between Ubaid and Uruk, the sudden appearance of complex administration and engineering, the myths about sages emerging from water to teach civilization, and a language with no known relatives, appearing fully formed, preserved with unusual stability. Each line of evidence points in the same direction, not invention but survival. Not the first spark, but the ember carried through darkness. And once you accept that possibility, one question starts looming over everything. If Sumer was rebuilding, what exactly was it rebuilding from? What did the drowned world look like? How complex was it? How far did it spread? What knowledge did it hold before sea levels rose and swallowed the coastlines? Because if the Sumerians really were preserving fragments of something older, then the next step isn't just to say there was a lost world. The next step is to try carefully, responsibly, to sketch its outline from the clues we have. And that means returning to the place where geology and memory overlap most strongly, the drowned landscapes themselves. Alright, so if Sumer was rebuilding, then we have to stop treating the lost world idea like a poetic metaphor and start asking a colder question. What land could actually disappear in a way that would erase most of its physical evidence, but still leave survivors behind? Because that's the paradox. For a civilization to vanish almost completely, it would need to be located in a place that could be drowned, buried, or otherwise removed from excavation. And at the same time, it would need to be populated enough and culturally coherent enough that survivors could carry stories, skills, and identity into the next world. And the Persian Gulf Basin fits that scenario almost perfectly. To understand why, you have to picture the map of the world at the end of the last ice age. Around 12,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today. That means coastlines weren't where we know them now. They were pushed far outward. Huge areas of land that are now underwater were exposed coastal plains, river deltas, continental shelves. And the Persian Gulf, as we know it today, wasn't a gulf. It was a valley, a broad, low-lying basin fed by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates would have flowed much farther south before meeting the sea. The Karun and other tributaries would have added more fresh water. Instead of saltwater open ocean, you likely had a mix of wetlands, river channels, freshwater lakes, marshes, an ecosystem that can support dense human settlement. Some researchers have called it a Persian Gulf oasis. And think about what that would have meant for humans living there. Water, fish, birds, reeds for building, fertile soils along river edges, grazing animals in surrounding grasslands. A landscape like that doesn't just support survival, it supports stability. And stability is the foundation for complexity. Not necessarily skyscrapers and writing, but trade networks, specialization, social hierarchy, ritual centers, and technical knowledge that develops over long periods. Now, here's the problem. If that basin flooded, it wouldn't leave a neat ruin you could dig up later. It would leave nothing you can reach. Most of it would be underwater, buried under marine sediment. And that's why we can talk about the possibility all day, but proving it becomes incredibly difficult. Still, the geological record gives us the mechanism. Between roughly 11,000 and 6,000 BC, sea levels rise dramatically as glaciers melt. It doesn't happen as one smooth curve, it happens in pulses. Meltwater surges that push the shoreline inland fast enough to be witnessed within a few lifetimes. So if you lived in that Persian Gulf Valley, the water wouldn't be a distant scientific chart. It would be the horizon creeping closer every year. Fields flooded, settlements abandoned, marshlands expanding, channels turning brackish. Then suddenly, places you'd walked your whole life are gone. And if you were forced to migrate, where could you go? North, inland, up the rivers, toward higher ground exactly where Sumer later rises. Now, here's where it gets eerie. When people studied the Gulf floor using sonar and marine surveying, they found ancient river channels carved into bedrock channels that shouldn't exist under today's water unless they were formed when the region was dry land. That's normal geology, but some sonar imaging has reportedly detected geometric anomalies along those channels' patterns consistent with possible structural remains. Nothing conclusively excavated, but enough to keep researchers uneasy. Because humans love rivers. We always have. If there were humans living in that basin for thousands of years, their settlements would cluster along watercourses. When the basin flooded, those settlements would be drowned, and their remains would be hidden in places archaeology can't easily reach. Now, zoom out. The Persian Gulf is not the only place where this happened. Across the world, the same rising sea process erased huge coastal plains. Southeast Asia once had the Sunda Shelf, a massive landmass connecting what are now Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the mainland. It flooded, turning highlands into islands and displacing populations into new geographies. In the Black Sea region, there's evidence that a breach event may have rapidly flooded what had been a freshwater basin, transforming it into the modern saltwater sea. Even if the exact speed is debated, the core point stands. Shorelines changed drastically, and human populations would have been displaced. Off the coasts of India, there are claims of submerged structures. Near Japan, the Yonaguni Formation sits underwater and continues to spark debate about whether it's natural or shaped. Even if you remain cautious about individual sites, the global pattern is undeniable. Coastal lands that humans lived on are now underwater, which means a huge portion of early human settlement, possibly the majority of it, is missing from the archaeological record. Not because it didn't exist, because it drowned. And this changes how we should interpret sudden civilizations like Sumer, because sudden is often a product of missing evidence. If people spent thousands of years developing complexity on landscapes that are now submerged, then when we finally catch them again when they appear inland in the record, it would look like they popped into existence fully formed. But they didn't pop into existence. They were displaced into visibility. They were forced into new refuges where their remains could survive above sea level. Now, here's the timeline that makes this really bite. Major sea level rise happens mostly between 11,000 and 6,000 BC. Sumer emerges as a recognizable civilization around 3,500 BC. That's a gap of roughly 2,500 years after sea levels stabilize at something like modern levels. And that gap is important because it means if displaced coastal populations moved inland, they didn't instantly build Uruk the moment they arrived. They would have spent generations, centuries, integrating, adapting, mixing with other populations, surviving in new landscapes, and slowly consolidating. In other words, a refugee movement doesn't produce a civilization overnight. It produces a long, painful period of reorganization, and then, eventually, if conditions allow, it produces a reconstruction, a second beginning. Now, that's exactly what the Sumerian King List looks like. It divides time into before the flood and after the flood, but it also suggests a long distance between the two worlds. Pre-flood kings reign for impossible spans. Post-flood kings start with long reigns, then normalize. If those numbers are encoding deep time rather than literal lifespans, the list might be preserving the memory of an era that stretches back into that post-Ice Age flood period and the long recovery afterward. And then, when writing finally appears, the memory gets pinned down in clay. Which brings us to another piece that fits too neatly to ignore. Demographic mixing. Genetic studies in the Near East show population movements and admixture over thousands of years. That's exactly what you'd expect if large numbers of people were displaced from drowned coastlines into refuges in higher ground. Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, Anatolia, the Levant, those populations wouldn't remain isolated. They would merge, trade, intermarry, sometimes compete, sometimes absorb one another. Over centuries, new hybrid cultures would form, and then, at some point, one of those hybrid cultures hits a tipping point: surplus agriculture, dense population, centralized administration, monumental religion, writing. That tipping point might be what we call Sumer, not a miracle, a culmination. Now, once you accept this framework, something else about Sumerian tradition starts to feel less strange, because if survivors carried knowledge inland, that knowledge would be unevenly distributed. Not everyone would be an engineer. Not everyone would know astronomy. The most valuable skills would be held by specialists, priestly lineages, builder families, scribal schools, teachers, and over time, those specialist lineages would become mythic. Because, to a population struggling to survive after catastrophe, a person who knows how to align temples to the stars, or calculate complex divisions, or plan irrigation gradients, might as well be supernatural. That's how the Apkallu tradition makes sense as memory, and it also sets up the emotional logic behind why Sumer became obsessed with record keeping. Because if you are the descendant of survivors, you inherit a fear. The fear of forgetting. The fear that if knowledge isn't passed down correctly, it dies. And when you finally have writing the ability to store memory outside the human brain, you use it. You use it obsessively. You stamp the past into clay so it can't wash away again. Which might explain why Sumer's earliest written evidence isn't poetry. It's accounting. It's the practical act of making civilization durable. Now, all of this is compelling as a synthesis, but there's still a missing step. If we're talking about a drowned world, we need to ask, what signs would it leave? Because even underwater, civilizations leave patterns, river channels, shoreline traces, possibly building foundations, and in some cases, if the flooding was rapid enough or sedimentation heavy enough, it might preserve certain layers in place. But proving this requires direct investigation, and that's why the most haunting part of this story is that the lost world might be sitting right there beneath the Persian Gulf, untouchable, unexcavated, and silent. A civilization that could be real, but remains beyond reach. Which brings us to the final synthesis. If the world before Sumer existed, drowned, and its survivors rebuilt, then Sumer isn't the only sudden civilization we should be re-evaluating. Because this pattern complexity, appearing earlier than expected, emerging fully formed, shows up in other places too. And if Sumer represents the first successful reconstruction, then the deeper truth might be this. Human civilization may have had more than one beginning, more than one rise, more than one loss, and the evidence of those earlier beginnings may be underwater. So next, we need to bring all the threads together: kingship, floods, migration, language, technical knowledge, and sketch the clearest possible outline of the world that drowned and how its surviving fragments became the civilization we call Sumer. If you've stayed with me this far, you can probably feel what's happening. The pieces aren't floating separately anymore. They're starting to lock into one shape, and that shape is unsettling. Because when you line everything up, text, dirt, language, myth, math, geology, you start to see Sumer not as humanity's first big step forward, but as something else entirely. A reconstruction, a second beginning, a civilization built by people who already carried memories of an older order, an order that didn't survive above sea level. So let's do something now. Let's step back and try to sketch the drowned world as carefully as we can, without fantasy, without leaps, just using the strongest clues. Picture the Persian Gulf region as it existed around 12,000 years ago. There is no gulf like we know today. Instead, there's a broad valley. The Tigris and Euphrates don't stop at Basra and spill into salt water. They run farther south as a combined system, joined by the Karun and other tributaries, feeding a huge freshwater landscape. Wetter climate, more grasslands, more woodland patches than today, marshlands thick with reeds, fish, waterfowl, grazing animals. This isn't a barren desert. This is prime habitat, and humans would have been there for the same reason humans are always somewhere, because the food is there, the water is there, and life is easier. If people live there for generations, what happens? They specialize. They develop local knowledge. They learn seasonal patterns. They refine tools and techniques. They establish trade along waterways. They build more permanent structures because the environment rewards stability, not skyscrapers, not necessarily writing, but complexity. Now the meltwater pulses begin. Sea level rise isn't just a little more water. It's an advancing boundary that eats land over centuries, sometimes fast enough to watch. At first, the edges flood, marshlands expand, saltwater pushes into freshwater systems, then the whole basin begins transforming from livable valley into an inlet, then into a gulf, and in the process, settlements vanish, people flee north, inland, up the rivers. That movement wouldn't be neat or uniform. It would come in waves. Some groups would move early, sensing the change. Others would hold on until they couldn't. Some would die. Some would migrate and resettle. Some would split, sending branches in different directions. Over time, displaced populations spread into Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, Anatolia, the Levant. They meet other groups, they intermarry, they trade, they fight, they merge, they form hybrid communities. Centuries pass. Memory stays, but it changes shape. And here's the key. Even if the broader population fragments, certain lineages preserve knowledge more carefully than others. Builders, priests, astronomers, administrators, the people who carry systems, the people who remember patterns, the people who know how to organize. In a displaced world, those skills become priceless, and those specialists become the center of reconstruction when stability returns. Now, fast forward to southern Mesopotamia around 5000 BC. This is roughly where the Ubaid horizon starts to solidify. We see stable settlements. We see long-term occupation. We see early temple structures still modest compared to later Uruk, but already suggesting social hierarchy and shared ritual systems. If the Persian Gulf oasis refugees hypothesis is correct, Ubaid could represent a long consolidation phase, mixed populations settling into the river valleys, slowly rebuilding. Then something changes around 4000 BC. The Uruk period begins, and it looks like a crystallization event. Suddenly, mass production in pottery, monumental architecture, urban planning, bureaucratic administration, writing. If Ubaid is the gathering of pieces, Uruk is the snapping together of a machine. And what's fascinating is that Uruk doesn't look like a society slowly inventing these things. It looks like a society implementing them, which is exactly what you'd expect if inherited knowledge finally found the conditions to become institutionalized. Because think about it, you can have technical knowledge in fragments for generations without building a city. You can know geometry and still live in small communities if you don't have surplus food, dense population, organized labor, stable politics. But once the conditions line up, once agriculture produces reliable surplus, once population density increases, once social hierarchy is stable enough to enforce large projects, suddenly all that preserved expertise becomes usable. And from the outside, it looks like a miracle. But from the inside, it would feel like finally remembering how to do something your ancestors once did. Now look back at the King List. It claims kingship existed before the flood. It claims that after the flood, kingship returned. It frames the flood as the central boundary in political history. If the drowned world idea is correct, then the King List is functioning less like a modern chronology and more like a survival document, a record that says, this order existed before destruction, and we are restoring it now. The impossibly long reigns become a symbol of deep distance, not literal lifespans, but the weight of time between the lost world and the rebuilt one. And the phrase, kingship descended from heaven, begins to sound less like supernatural poetry and more like ideological memory. Kingship came from an older, established order, an external source relative to Mesopotamia. Now look at myth. Enki and the Abzu, wisdom rising from water, the Apkallu emerging from the sea to teach writing, law, city building, astronomy. In this framework, the myths are doing what myths always do, preserving history in human-friendly form. The teachers become sages, then demigods, then fishmen, because the literal truth refugees with expertise from drowned lands is harder to carry unchanged across millennia. But the core stays. Knowledge came from the water, which fits Sumer's own identity phrase. Brought up from the water. Now look at language. Sumerian appears with no known relatives, a complete isolate in a region dominated by Semitic language families. If its relatives existed in drowned coastal plains, they would be gone. Sumerian would remain as a fossil tongue, preserved by identity and institutions. And then look at the technology again. Base 60 mathematics, astronomical cycles, engineering skill in temple building and irrigation, all appearing early with no visible developmental stages. In this model, the missing developmental stages happened earlier, outside the written record, possibly in places that are now underwater, and then continued through oral and apprenticeship traditions during migration and consolidation. Writing appears relatively late in the story, not as the beginning of knowledge, but as the tool that finally freezes it into permanence. So what we call the dawn of history might actually be the moment that survivors finally gained the technology to stop their memory from drifting. Now, here's the part that changes the emotional tone of everything. If Sumer really is the first successful reconstruction after catastrophe, then its obsession with temples, alignment, record keeping, legitimacy, and cosmic order makes deep psychological sense. Because what do you build when you're terrified the world can end? You build something that feels anchored. Temples aligned to the sky, because the sky is stable even when the land changes. Administration written into clay, because the mind can forget and the flood can erase, but baked clay can endure. King lists that assert continuity, because the worst fear isn't just death, it's meaninglessness, the idea that everything your ancestors built can vanish without trace. Sumer feels like a civilization haunted by loss, not in the way we usually describe ancient cultures, but in the way survivors behave, obsessively preserving structure, recording everything, reinforcing legitimacy through connection to an older world. And if you accept that, then one of the most haunting images in this entire story becomes the simplest. A scribe pressing wet clay, not because he's inventing writing for fun, because he's terrified of forgetting, because he believes his people are carrying something fragile across time, and he wants it to last. Now, here's where we turn toward the present, because the story stops being ancient the moment you realize what it implies about us. We live on coastlines. We build on deltas. We settle in low-lying plains. We do it because those places are fertile, trade-friendly, rich, comfortable, exactly the same reasons humans lived in drowned coastal basins thousands of years ago. And we're watching sea levels rise again, not in a mythological sense, in a measured, documented sense. So the Sumerian story, whether you interpret it conservatively or boldly, becomes a mirror, because the deeper truth might be this: civilization isn't a straight line. It may be a cycle of building, loss, and rebuilding. And what determines whether knowledge survives isn't whether a society is advanced. It's whether it manages to preserve memory through collapse. Sumer's greatest invention might not have been writing, or irrigation, or base 60 math. It might have been the idea that memory can be stored outside the human body in durable form, so the next world can inherit something instead of starting from zero. So now we're at the final convergence. We've traced kingship, flood layers, geological drowning, migration, mythology, language, technical knowledge. One question remains, the one that pulls all of this into a single human point. If the first kings of Sumer were the inheritors of a drowned world, what were they trying so desperately to keep alive? Not just knowledge, in a vague sense. What was the mission? What was the emotional core? Why did they build temples and write lists and preserve stories like their lives depended on it? Because maybe, to them, they did. And that's where the ending of this story lives. Not in the past, but in the warning and the hope that Sumer's legacy offers to anyone living on a planet that changes. Which brings us to the last stretch, to the moment we stand in Eridu around 3500 BC, and watch the first great temple rise, not as the beginning of civilization, but as the proof that something survived, and what that means for us. Imagine standing in Eridu around 3500 BC, not as an archaeologist digging it up thousands of years later, but as someone alive in that moment, watching the first major temple rise from the ground. The builders don't look confused. They don't look like they're guessing. They don't argue over whether the platform should be higher, or whether the walls will hold, or whether the bricks should be shaped differently. They move with confidence, like people following a plan that already exists. The temple's corners align, the proportions make sense, the platform drains correctly, the interior chambers are laid out with intention. There's order in the design, and there's order in the execution. That is not what first attempts look like. A truly newborn society would make visible mistakes. They'd try a structure, watch it crack, rebuild it, modify it, iterate. You'd expect a messy trail. But in the archaeological record, Sumer looks like it shows up already knowing the answers. And in the framework we've been building, that's because they weren't inventing from scratch. They were remembering temples their ancestors built in places that no longer existed above water. Remembering astronomical alignments learned under older skies. Remembering ratios and building traditions carried across generations like a family heirloom. And maybe, most importantly, remembering the central trauma that shaped everything. A world can end. That knowledge changes you. It changes what you value. It changes what you preserve. It changes what you build. Because if your ancestors survived the drowning of a homeland, if they were displaced from an oasis into a harsher interior, then stability becomes sacred. Order becomes sacred. Memory becomes sacred. And that's what Sumer feels like when you look at it through this lens. Not a civilization casually experimenting with governance, a civilization determined to anchor itself to something that can't be washed away again. Now take the first kings, Alulim, Alalgar, and Menluana, whether those names refer to individuals, dynasties, symbolic eras, or compressed memory, doesn't actually change the emotional meaning of the list, because the king list is doing something more than math. It's declaring continuity. It's saying, kingship did not begin here. It came from before. It survived the flood boundary, and we are the inheritors. That is a survivor culture speaking. That's the voice of a people saying, we are not the first, we are what remains. And suddenly, the obsession with writing makes sense too. Because the earliest writing in Mesopotamia isn't epic poetry. It's accounting, it's inventory, it's lists of grain, sheep, labor assignments, offerings. That might sound boring, but it's actually profound if you think about why a civilization would choose that as its first durable records. Writing begins as preservation, not art, not philosophy, preservation of systems. Because if your culture understands that collapse is real, you don't start by writing love songs. You start by writing what keeps the machine running. Who owes what? Who owns what? What's stored where? What must be tracked so the whole thing doesn't fall apart? Clay tablets become the opposite of floodwater, a technology designed to make society durable. And that's why those tablets hit so hard when you see them behind museum glass. Because they aren't just the first writing. They're the first time human beings successfully anchored memory outside the mind on a wide scale, so that the next generation wouldn't have to rely entirely on oral transmission, so that the story couldn't drift as easily, so that the knowledge wouldn't fade. Now, if we follow that thread, Sumer's true legacy stops being they invented civilization. It becomes something more human. They prove civilization can be carried through catastrophe, not perfectly, not unchanged, but carried. They are what happens when a world ends and something survives long enough to rebuild. Which means Sumer might not be the first civilization. It might be the first civilization that successfully recovered. And here's why that matters for us. Because we live with a modern version of the same illusion archaeologists once had when they first dug in Mesopotamia, the illusion that progress is a straight line. We imagine civilization rising steadily, village to city, city to empire, empire to modernity, like a staircase we keep climbing. But Earth doesn't care about our staircase. Earth operates on cycles. Ice ages come and go. Coastlines move. Rivers shift. Seas rise. Deltas sink. Storm patterns change. And we have built our world, our modern, global civilization, on coastlines and low-lying plains, just like the people who may have lived in the Persian Gulf basin. We don't do it because we're foolish. We do it because those places are the richest. Trade routes, fertile land, access to water, easy transport. It's the same logic humans have always followed, but it comes with the same risk humans have always faced. So here's the question, Sumer. Force is on us, whether we like it or not. If our world ended tomorrow, if catastrophe struck in a way that fractured our systems, what would survive? Not just would people survive, but would the knowledge survive? Would the next civilization, rising centuries later, see evidence of us and understand what we were? Or would it find scattered ruins, corrupted storage, decayed paper, eroded cities, and assume we were primitive? Would it think civilization began with them? Or would it inherit enough durable memory to realize they are part of a longer cycle that they are rebuilding, like Sumer rebuilt? Because here's the brutal truth about modern knowledge. So much of it is fragile. Digital storage fails. Formats become unreadable. Power grids collapse. Networks vanish. Data rots. Even books decay if they aren't protected. Even concrete crumbles. Even steel rusts into dust. We feel secure because our information is everywhere. But everywhere isn't the same thing as durable. And Sumer understood durability in a way we sometimes forget. They wrote into clay. They baked it. They stored it. And because of that, you and I can still hold their words in our hands 5,000 years later. So, what will people hold from us 5,000 years from now? If the seas rise, if coastlines flood, if cities drown, will our memory become myth? Will future cultures tell stories about a lost world that used lightning trapped in boxes, that spoke through invisible air, that built towers of glass on the ocean's edge? Will they find fragments of satellites and plastic and strange alloys and debate whether we were real? And will there be a king list of us, some record that bridges a boundary between an old world and a new one? Or will the boundary be blank? Now, I don't mean this as doom. I mean it as perspective, because Sumer's story, if read as the story of survivors, actually carries hope. It says, a world can end, and knowledge can still survive, not because the catastrophe is kind, but because humans are stubborn, because humans teach, because humans remember, because humans refuse to let everything vanish. And if Sumer truly was built by descendants of displaced people, then its existence is proof of something very simple and very powerful. Even if a civilization is wiped from the map, it can leave descendants who carry its spark forward. So maybe the real question isn't whether catastrophe happens. Maybe catastrophe always happens. The question is whether enough survives physically, culturally, intellectually for the next world to rebuild without starting from total darkness. And that's where Sumer's ending becomes strangely personal. Because when you think about those early scribes pressing symbols into clay, the act looks almost like a prayer. Not a prayer to gods, a prayer to time. A way of saying, we were here, we knew things, we built, we lost, we rebuilt. Please don't let it all disappear again. And it was bit, and they succeeded. Even if we argue about whether the drowned world existed exactly as imagined, even if we debate the interpretations, the undeniable reality remains. Sumer's people carried something forward. They built systems that outlasted them. They preserved memory in a form durable enough to cross millennia. And through that, they left us a message, whether intentional or not, that feels almost like a warning and a guide. Because the moment you stop seeing Sumer as a beginning and start seeing it as a recovery, you realize this story isn't only about ancient Iraq, it's about the human condition, the cycle of building, losing, and trying again. So that's the heart of it. The first kings of Sumer may not have been the first kings in human history. They may have been the inheritors of kingship from a world that drowned. They may have been the ones who carried the last intact fragments of an older order into a new era and anchored it to clay, stone, and ritual so it wouldn't dissolve. And if that's true, then Sumer's legacy isn't just civilization began here. It's something quieter, something heavier. It's the proof that memory can cross catastrophe, that even if the waters rise, something can endure. And now we're almost at the end of this rewrite, but there's one last piece to land cleanly. Because if this story is about memory surviving destruction, then it has to end on the thing Sumer did better than anyone before it. They turned memory into permanence. They made history hard to erase. And in doing that, they gave the next world, our world, a chance to see the outline of what came before. So, in the final part, we bring it all together. What Sumer truly left behind, what it implies about the possibility of lost epochs, and what it asks of us as we stand on the edge of our own changing planet. If you strip this entire story down to its core, it's not really about temples. It's not really about kings. It's not even really about floods. It's about one thing: what survives. Because Sumer is famous for being early. But what makes it haunting is how much of it feels like it's carrying something older, like it's holding a torch that didn't originate in its own hands. That's what's sitting underneath every clay tablet, every king list, every myth about wisdom rising from the deep, a fear of loss, and the determination to outlive it. Think about what it means to live in a world where your ancestors tell stories about land that no longer exists, where they insist there were cities before your cities, where they claim there were kings before your kings, where the most important moment in all remembered time is a boundary line called the flood, is opounded. Even if you never saw the flood yourself, even if it happened thousands of years before you were born, its shadow would still shape everything you do. Because catastrophe isn't just a physical event, it's a psychological inheritance. And if your culture believes you're living after the end of an age, you don't treat society like a casual experiment. You treat it like something that has to be made durable. That's why Sumer feels the way it feels. It feels deliberate, almost defensive, like a civilization building walls not just around cities, but around memory itself. This is why it matters that the King List wasn't stored in a myth cabinet. It sat among administrative records, because legitimacy wasn't just political, it was existential. Kings needed to prove they belonged to a continuity that stretched beyond collapse. They weren't simply ruling land, they were guarding order. And order, in Mesopotamian thought, was cosmic. It wasn't a human invention. It was something that existed in heaven, in the realm of stable patterns, which is why kingship descended from heaven is such a loaded phrase. In modern language, it's basically saying, the blueprint is older than us. We didn't make it. We received it. We restored it. Now, once you start thinking this way, the Sumerian obsession with the stars becomes more than curiosity too, because the sky doesn't flood. The sky doesn't shift the way rivers shift and coastlines drown. The constellations move slowly, predictably. The cycles repeat. Venus returns. So, a civilization haunted by the fragility of land would naturally anchor itself to the stable clock overhead, align temples to the cardinal directions, mark solstices, track lunar months, write calendars, not because astronomy is cool, but because astronomy is reliability in a world that can erase you. And this also reframes Sumer's greatest invention, writing. not as a creative breakthrough, but as survival technology. Writing is a way to stop memory from mutating. Oral tradition is powerful, but it drifts. Generations compress time, symbols replace details, myths bloom around trauma. Writing freezes things. It pins them. It says, this is what we know, and we are not letting it dissolve. And Sumer chose clay for that job. Clay is everywhere in southern Mesopotamia. It's cheap, it's accessible, it's perfect for a society built on river mud. But clay is also durable when baked. And that choice, whether intentional at first or discovered through necessity, became one of the most important decisions in human history, because it meant Sumer could launch messages across millennia. And in a strange way, that makes Sumer feel like it's speaking directly to us now, not in a mystical way. In a blunt, physical way, a tablet survives. We read it, we hear the voice, and the voice tells us two things at the same time. We built this. We remember something older. Now, I want to be careful here, because it's easy to get swept into the romance of a lost civilization story. And the truth is, we don't have an excavated underwater city in the Persian Gulf that proves everything beyond doubt. We don't have a carved stone sign that says, "Welcome to the pre-flood empire." What we have are converging lines of evidence, and that matters. Because in serious historical thinking, you rarely get one perfect smoking gun. You get patterns, you get echoes, you get multiple independent threads pointing in the same direction. And the threads here are unusually consistent. A sudden rise of urban complexity with little visible local developmental lead-up. Flood deposits that cut cultural sequences at key sites. Texts that insist on a world before the flood and a restoration afterward. Myths about sages emerging from water to teach civilization. Technical systems appearing early with striking sophistication. A language isolate appearing fully formed as if carried from elsewhere. Taken separately, each element has alternative explanations, but taken together, they form something harder to wave away. A narrative of survival, a narrative of displaced people, a narrative of inherited knowledge. And if that narrative is even partly true, it changes how we interpret not just Sumer, but the entire concept of the beginning. Because the beginning might be a measurement artifact. It might be the point where a surviving population becomes visible again above water, above the floodline, above the missing layers, which means history might contain other hidden gaps like this, other drowned shelves, other erased coastlines, other cultural arcs we can't see because they sit beneath seas and sediment. If so, then the real mystery isn't that civilization appeared suddenly. The real mystery is how much of civilization might be missing. Now bring it back to the most human part of all this. Why Sumer preserved the memory so intensely. If your ancestors watched the shoreline swallow their world, you would grow up with a different relationship to permanence. You would see land as temporary. You would see stability as something that must be built and maintained, not assumed. You would see knowledge as fragile, and you would treat memory like a sacred duty. So, when Sumerians talk about me, the divine ordinances, the fundamental principles of civilization, they aren't describing abstract theology. They're describing the things that keep a society from falling apart. Law, measurement, ritual order, kingship, crafts, writing, agriculture, the organization of labor. In their worldview, these weren't inventions, they were inheritances. And you can almost hear the emotional urgency in that idea. If these principles are lost, civilization collapses. If these principles survive, civilization can be rebuilt. Which brings us to the most sobering part of this story. We like to believe that what we've built is permanent. We like to believe our knowledge is too widespread to vanish. But history and geology don't support that confidence. Whole human worlds have already disappeared beneath the sea, entire shorelines erased. If Sumer really is a reconstruction, then it's proof that collapse doesn't end the human story, but it does reset the conditions. And what survives the reset depends on preservation, which circles us right back to the fingerprints in clay. Those are not just accidental marks. They are evidence of someone caring enough to press memory into matter. Someone who understood, even if only instinctively, that the world can forget you, and that forgetting is the final death. So maybe the deepest truth hidden in Sumer isn't an exotic claim about lost empires. Maybe it's something simpler. Maybe it's this: civilization is not guaranteed. Memory is not automatic. Knowledge survives only if people choose to carry it. Sumer chose. They wrote. They built. They recorded. They aligned. They listed. They preserved. And whether they were the first or the second, their achievement remains the same. They made memory durable. Which leaves us with one last step, one final landing. Because every long story like this needs to resolve into a single, clear thought, the kind you can sit with after the video ends. So in the final part, we're going to bring it all home. What it means if Sumer was a rebuilding, what that suggests about the world that drowned, and what lesson this ancient memory might be trying to pass to us here, now, in a world that's changing again. So here we are at the edge of the story, where the ancient world stops feeling ancient. Because once you see Sumer as a possible reconstruction, it stops being a museum topic. It becomes a mirror. Let's lay it out cleanly. Sumer rises around 3,500 BC with cities that look planned, temples aligned to the sky, mathematics built on base 60, administration that feels institutional, and kingship appearing as a fully formed concept, descended from heaven, not invented locally. Underneath these cities, archaeology finds discontinuities, shifts in material culture, changes in burial practices, abrupt transitions like the Ubaid to Uruk break. At multiple sites, we find flood deposits interrupting habitation sequences. And in the texts, the flood isn't a minor story. It's the boundary line dividing history into two worlds. Then, mythology insists on teachers rising from water, sages bringing civilization, wisdom safeguarded in the deep, a lost paradise land tied to water and sunrise. And the language itself, Sumerian, stands alone, with no known relatives, appearing fully formed like a preserved fossil from somewhere else. If you take each piece separately, you can argue alternatives: symbolic reign lengths, administrative standardization, natural cultural change, myth as metaphor. But when you take the whole pattern together, it creates a single haunting possibility. Sumer didn't begin civilization. Sumer preserved it. Or, at the very least, Sumer preserved fragments of something older, something that didn't survive above sea level. And whether that older world was a fully urban civilization or a sophisticated complex of coastal Neolithic cultures, the point is the same. There may have been human worlds before the world we can easily excavate. Worlds built on coastlines and river basins that are now underwater. Worlds erased, not by war or collapse alone, but by geography itself, changing by sea levels rising, shorelines retreating, land disappearing. In that scenario, the first kings of Sumer aren't the first rulers of history. They are the inheritors of memory, descendants of displaced people, carrying knowledge forward through generations of disruption until they finally reached a place stable enough to build again. And if that's true, then Sumer's real miracle isn't how fast it invented civilization. It's how long it kept civilization alive before it could rebuild. Because if the drowned world timeline is even roughly correct, you're looking at thousands of years where knowledge had to survive without writing. That means survival depended on people, on teachers, on apprenticeship, on story, on rituals that encoded procedure on lineages that guarded skills the way you'd guard fire in a storm. And then, when writing finally arrived, it wasn't just a convenient tool, it was a weapon against forgetting, a way to make the fragile durable, a way to make memory outlast the body. That's what Sumer did. They didn't just build cities, they built continuity. They turned knowledge into something that could outlive catastrophe. They proved that even if a world ends, the next world doesn't have to start at zero if enough survives. Now, here's the part that lands hardest for us. Because we live in the same kind of world Sumer's ancestors may have lived in. We live on coastlines. We build on deltas. We cluster our populations and our infrastructure in the exact landscapes most vulnerable to sea level rise and environmental instability. And we also live in a time where we're watching those landscapes change again, not as myth, as measurement, as reality. So the Sumerian story again, whether you interpret it cautiously or boldly, forces one question onto the table. If the waters rise again, what survives? Not just physically, culturally, intellectually. What parts of our world will remain readable? What parts will become corrupted, fragmented, mythologized? If future archaeologists dug through our ruins 5,000 years from now, would they find a clear record of who we were? Or would they find scattered fragments, plastic and alloys, and buried foundations, and argue about whether we were advanced or primitive, real or legendary? Would they understand us? Or would they invent stories to fill the gaps? Because here's a modern irony that should make us uneasy. We have more information than any civilization in history, but we may have less durability. So much of our knowledge is stored in formats that require infrastructure, electricity, servers, networks, software compatibility, decoding tools. If those systems collapse, data becomes noise, and even physical media, paper, film, hard drives degrade, rot, or become unreadable without maintenance. Sumer wrote on clay. We write on light, and light doesn't survive a dark age very well. So maybe the deepest lesson Sumer offers isn't a claim about lost empires. Maybe it's a warning about fragility. And maybe it's also a kind of hope, because Sumer's existence suggests something important. Humans can carry knowledge through collapse if they prioritize memory and teaching. The act of preservation is not automatic. It's a choice. Sumer chose. They wrote down systems. They recorded legitimacy. They fixed calendars. They kept lists. They made their civilization durable enough that thousands of years later we can still hear its voice. And the voice, when you listen closely, isn't just saying, "We were first." It's saying, "We survived." It's saying, "We rebuilt." It's saying, "Don't underestimate how easily the world can erase you." It not to S. And it's also saying, don't underestimate how stubborn humans can be about not letting that happen. So, maybe the most honest way to end this is with the same thought Sumer left behind in every temple alignment, every king list, every baked tablet sitting in the dark under museum glass. A civilization is not defined only by what it builds. It's defined by what it saves. And if Sumer truly was a rebuilding, if its first kings were the inheritors of a drowned world, then their greatest act wasn't ruling. It wasn't conquering. It wasn't even building. It was remembering, holding on to order when the world had proven it could dissolve, carrying knowledge across centuries of uncertainty until it could be anchored in something that lasted. So tonight, when the lights are out and everything is quiet, I want you to sit with one simple image, a scribe pressing wet clay, not knowing his words would outlive empires, not knowing his tablet would travel across 5,000 years, but believing deep in his bones that memory matters enough to fight for. Because maybe that's what this entire story really is. Not an ancient mystery, a message, A reminder that the world can change fast, that landscapes can vanish, that history can be erased, and that the only thing that stands between knowledge and oblivion is the choice to preserve it, to teach it, to record it, to pass it on. And if the first kings of Sumer were the last inheritors of something ancient, then their story isn't just about what came before, it's about what comes next. So, if you made it all the way to the end, drop a comment with the word remember. I'll know you heard it. And tell me, do you think Sumer was the beginning or the second beginning? Either way, the clay is still speaking, and we're still listening.